changed the brakes on a Hyundai Sonata 2010. Well, I put the car in neutral before I jacked it up. That way, now that the wheel's off the ground, I can spin the front wheel, it's a front wheel drive, just to make sure I can't hear any grinding noises or that there isn't any resistance that might indicate, say, a bad caliper or other failure. These electric impact wrenches work great, especially if you don't want to fire up the air compressor. And this one costs about $100, $110 maybe. Well, there's 4 things we're going to do while we're in here. First, we're going to replace the pads, of course, that are low. Also, I'm going to replace the rotors. They don't look terrible, but we've got new ones, so we're going to put them on. We're also going to check the brake line and make sure there's no blockages. And we're going to grease and clean the guide pins. Well, I took out the 2 guide pin bolts, which are 14 millimeter. And, of course, there's one here above that guide pin and by that guide pin. And when those bolts are loose, the caliper, which is 2 pieces, this outer piece is loose, and so we'll be able to take that off. And you can use a screwdriver to get a little extra leverage. And I have a wire ready because I'm going to hang it from the spring or any of these parts up here because I don't want to put any pressure on the brake line feeding the piston. Well, the pads are easy to get to right now. Well, you can tell it was time. There's probably about a 32nd of an inch of pad left.
Go.
What I do like to see is that the pads are worn down evenly, or there's about the same amount of pad left on each side. So the screws to remove the rotor are Phillips, but they are not a number 2 Phillips, which is probably the most common. They're actually a number 3. And it's very important because it's easy to strip these screws if you use a screwdriver that's the wrong size. The number 3 fits in perfectly and doesn't have any wiggle. A number 2, when you put it in, will wiggle back and forth and is more likely to strip a screw because it's not getting full contact. I'm going to shock the screw loose, or I have a dead blow hammer. I'm going to use a dead blow hammer, which just has some, you can hear that rattle, the steel or lead buckshot, just to add some more impact at the moment that all of the buckshot goes to one side. And we're just going to sort of knock the screw loose, or if there is any rust, kind of break the corrosion. Just give it a nice solid tap. Hopefully your screws are in as good condition as mine are. I barely had to torque it very hard, and they come right off. So they probably, yeah, look at those screws, they look brand new. You want to keep anti-seize on these. I have stripped these screws before and it's not This time I'm going to hit the rotor with the dead blow. Once I get this off, before I put the new one on, I'm gonna put anti-seize behind this plate to make sure the next time it comes right off. Keep spinning it and hitting it. I'm going for a steel hammer, and this time I'm going to strike it on this edge here instead of on the rotor. Alright, there it is. You gotta put anti-seize behind that plate or it's a pain. To remove the bracket of the caliper, you want to turn your wheel so that you have room to put a wrench or extension bar on. And there's 2 bolts. There's one right here that would come off, and there's also the other bolt which you really can't see at all. It's inside of this suspension piece, and you can see the extension that I have sticking out there. I think on the later models of the Sonata, they moved the bolt to a more convenient location. I was almost fighting the brake line trying to remove it. Of course, the bottom bolt was a lot easier to get to. Now the rest of the caliper will come off, and now I'll take the rotor off. I'll put anti-seize on this surface all around here, so the next time the rotor will come off better. So before I open up the package for the new brake pads, I'll just compare it with one of the ones I took off, make sure it's the same product. So the first step is always to compare, make sure you have the right size rotor. which just looks good. Front rotors on a 010 Sonata were about $20 on Rock Auto. And as I promised, the surface that mates with the rotor is going to get lots of anti-seize. So here, put the rotor on. And make sure to line up these two screws. It'll only go on one way. Let's put some anti-seize on this little Phillips screw. Before I put this caliper back on and new brakes, I'm going to clean the guide pins. So to do that, just carefully peel back this rubber seal to expose the guide pin and just pull that guy out. You can see these move very nice. I'm still going to clean them though. The two guide pins are not actually the same. This one I'm holding in this hand with the glove, this has a rubber seal right at the end. This one does not have a rubber seal, and you can't mix them up. Now it's natural to feel that the one with the rubber seal won't move or glide as easily as the one without the rubber seal, and that should make sense. In order to access the hole, you have to remove this rubber cover, but do not tear it, because if there's a hole, then dirt can get in, and that will seize the caliper. 1/4 inch dowel rod with a rounded end works very well with a cloth to kind of push in there and get all the grease out. Now I'll wipe the grease off of the guide pins. Well, I like the guide pins really shiny, and this $5 wheel from Harbor Freight does a great job of bringing them a lot cleaner. And finally, we want to get the grease out of the rubber cover, which is rubbing alcohol. Use our stick again. Some kinds of grease will damage rubber, like lithium grease. However, we're going to use silicone grease because it's safe with plastic and rubber. So I'll put the rubber pieces back on. Just put a little bit of grease on there. I'll try to cover the whole surface. Work the grease in all around, and it does feel better. It is so much better when it is clean and polished. Probably the real value is the fact that it causes you to look at your guide pins more often. Otherwise, if you never looked at them to grease them, you'd never know if something bad was wrong with them. And make sure the seal comes back over like that, and also check again that there are no breaks in the rubber. We don't want anything outside getting into these. Now the metal clips that the brake shoes or the brake pads go into, just gonna scrub that with, this is diesel fuel. It does a good job of cleaning them. Now it's very important that not only do the pads fit where they're supposed to go, they also need to be able to slide back and forth. Otherwise, the whole system doesn't work. The pad has to be able to move back and forth. It's very important that the pads are able to slide back and forth so that whenever the caliper releases, the brake pads also come back and they release, and that way you won't wear your rotors down very quickly. Not only would the rotors take more wear, but the pads will also disappear really fast. We're going to lubricate the tabs anyway with high temperature grease, and there's no rubber involved here, so we don't have to use the silicone grease. Just grease all the contact areas between this little clip and brake pad. You can see it's real happy sliding with the grease. This bolt has some rusty threads. It's possible that all the ones that were actually being used are fine, the front portion, but I'm just going to wire wheel the rust away and then anti-seize it all. So I'm just going to, since the bottom bolt is accessible, I'm just going to use it kind of as a pin. So the first bolt is in almost all the way, and the second bolt goes inconveniently behind this structural member here. So I'm going to carefully try to insert it. I may have to wiggle this back and forth to get it to find it. You can see this, but the head of the bolt is right here. We got this piece on. So put the old brake pad on top of the piston and then slide the compressor tool underneath, and then carefully, start applying pressure. Make sure it glides evenly. If there's any hesitation and it doesn't want to glide, then you need to rebuild the caliper. That is as far back as it will go. Now I can unwire the caliper and put it back into place. That feels pretty good. So the two caliper bolts are next. And the one on the bottom. It's finished. It's ready for the wheel, except we're going to use some rubbing alcohol and degrease both sides of the rotor, the front side and the behind side. It's winter now, so the tires we're putting back on are actually winter tires. I'm torquing them to 80 foot-pounds, and then I'll take it for a test drive and then